Hello and welcome to our weekly analysis of the Russian war against Ukraine at WIPEC. Today we welcome Professor Heinz Gärtner, who will help us understand some of the backgrounds of this conflict. Heinz Gärtner is a professor emeritus for political science at the University of Vienna. He's an expert on international and European security and armament control, and he's also the scientific director of the International Institute for Peace. Hello and welcome, Professor Gärtner.
Hello.
And as usual, I also welcome my colleague Alexander Stipsitz. Good afternoon into the Czech Republic.
Good afternoon from České Budějovice. Hezký odpoledne. Professor Gärtner, it's a great pleasure to see you again after a few years. I fondly remember our last talk that kept me thinking for a while. So let me start off with a biggie, so to speak. You are the chair of the advisory board of the International Institute for Peace in Vienna. Let me ask about peace. As an eternal optimist, I do hope that we will find peace again rather soon in this situation. But what would you say could be the precursors for peace? Do you see a development towards that? There have been, apparently there is talks between Zelensky and Putin. Apparently there are talks going on in that direction. I hope this is not just a rumor. But again, what is your thought? What could be the road for peace? Let's start with that and then.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you also for organizing this meeting. I'm also glad to see you again and to be on your show. Peace is the overarching issue here, and it's important. And peace failed because diplomacy failed before the war. There were possibilities to create stable and peaceful situation, at least to prevent war. That did not happen. Now we have the war, and it's a brutal war. It's increasingly gruesome and atrocities, and it's indiscriminate against civilians more and more. And now conditions for peace have to achieved again, and has to be created. So it has to be actively organized. That means immediate ceasefire. But ceasefire does not mean stop of fighting for these humanitarian corridors. Ceasefire means stable time where you can start again substantial negotiations, diplomacy. The suggestions are on the table, they are possible, but just talking is not diplomacy. So you have to be substantial suggestions here as well, and there have to be concessions. Concessions now on both sides, since the war is going on now, and ceasefire has to be used, because if fighting goes on during the talks, they are not helpful, because each side would try to exploit the military situation to get more concessions from the other side. So there has to be a freeze of the military operations right now. We know the great strategist Karl von Clausewitz. He wrote his book on war in the 19th century, and he observed this war itself especially always pushes for the extreme. So the war mechanism will continue if you don't have actively political interference. And that's what we see in Ukraine as well. But of course, if one party, and that's the Ukraine, is weaker militarily, it must have an interest to stop the war. Otherwise, the result will be disastrous. But I have to say, also the result for Russia might be a disaster. Also, it might win immediate in the battlefield, but in the long run, Russia will have to pay a price in Ukraine as well. So both sides have an interest for negotiations, but of course they have to be face-saving, but at the same time substantial.
Chris, may I tag on here? You said something so fundamentally important, concession. What concessions could you imagine? We have been speculating about a neutral Ukraine being allowed to join the European Union in some way, shape, or form, but obviously not NATO. But what could you imagine that Putin is able to give without losing face, and what the Ukraine is able to give without losing its what Ukraine without the article, what Ukraine is able to give without losing itself?
Yes, you mentioned that. That's the most important issue, and I think that's also the main driving force for Putin to start this war. It's the perspective of NATO membership of Ukraine. So that doesn't justify the war, because war would not be a solution, and it makes the whole situation worse, not only for the people, but also for Russia itself, because now he wanted to prevent NATO on his doorsteps again, and now NATO is increasing deployment in Poland and the Baltic states. So Putin achieves the contrary what he wanted to do, with a very, very high price for the Ukrainian people, but also for Russian soldiers, I have to say. So that's what I'm saying is not a justification, but it's an explanation. And an explanation is that NATO expanded permanently in the 90s and in the early 2000s. And Putin several times actually mentioned that he would not, that's a red line for him. And nevertheless, at the Bucharest summit in 2008, NATO promised Georgia and Ukraine NATO membership without giving them the membership action plan, which means a concrete timetable. That's what Angela Merkel prevented to happen. But nevertheless, in the perception of Putin, Ukraine were making big strides towards NATO membership. And then he said, okay, I now want to stop this, and started this unjustified, non-provoked, not immediately provoked war. And but it would have been possible at latest 2014 already. Russia and Putin occupied Crimea. That was an early sign already, and he supported these militias in Donbass. There would have been already the solution of a neutral Ukraine. So not supporting the militias again, and not to continue to support the militias, and at the same time a promise that NATO would not take in Ukraine, but also in his request in December last year, only NATO was mentioned. Only NATO. Some unrealistic requests as well, that NATO infrastructure would be withdrawn from already members of NATO, which unrealistic. But there was also this guarantees that Ukraine would not enter NATO. NATO, of course, and the US could not give this guarantee, but the Ukraine could have already said, no, we are going to be neutral, like Austria, for example, if the Russian militias would leave, and Ukraine would get its territorial integrity, sovereignty back. Now, of course, Donbass and Donetsk, Luhansk separated, so-called independent republics. Russian troops are in Ukraine. The situation is much worse. But still, I guess this is the most important issue here. If Ukraine declares neutrality and not to become member, the whole paradox and the tragedy is that NATO would not accept Ukraine for the next decade anyway. So it's not worth fighting and dying for fiction here. So that it is happening now. So it would be easy for both sides to say, okay, Putin would get this guarantee of non-NATO membership, and Ukraine would say, okay, we are not joining, and we put this in the condition and maybe supported by international law. That would be the most important issue here. Of course, then we have Crimea, and then we have Donbass. For Donbass, the situation is much worse because it's not easy to think that Russia now would give back these provinces to Ukraine. Nevertheless, it might be possible with an exchange for the Crimea. So Ukraine would accept that Crimea remains Russian with strong autonomy status. And on the other hand, Ukraine would give a strong autonomy to the Russian-speaking population in Donbass, that on the basis of the Minsk agreements. The Minsk agreements were not possible, but still, because still there was this NATO issue looming about this issue, because everybody was complaining Minsk agreement, decentralization, autonomy, disengagement, all these questions that have not really been implemented. Why? Because the NATO question was still there. Now that we have a war and still the NATO question is here. So the next time Putin and Zelensky should sit down during a ceasefire and say, okay, we discuss this NATO membership and neutrality. That would be face-saving in the first place. Of course, now we have this argument, okay, it's a forced neutrality. It would have been peaceful in 2014 or earlier already. Forced. Yeah, that might be true. That's the situation. However, that I'm now speculating, it would be possible after a while to have a big conference like the Helsinki 75 conference, but another historical analogy would be the Vienna Congress 1815, when the victory powers organized this, and this Congress kept peace for a century with some interruptions in the middle of the century with the Crimean War. But they accepted, because it was after the Napoleonic Wars and the so-called French Wars. But this victory power also then accepted France as a part of this Vienna Congress. So that could be happen with Russia as well, of course, after the war is over. And formally, this Congress gave birth Switzerland's neutrality. So Switzerland, so this was the basis of Swiss neutrality. I could imagine later on, if it is a forced neutrality now, it could be a voluntary neutrality based on international law later. So that's a speculation. That is the best case scenario what we can do now. I do have worst case scenarios as well, so I can talk about them now. So what is the alternative to this neutrality? Maybe the worst case scenarios are more likely. If you want, I can continue talking about the
No,
worst case.
I don't want. You should know, of course. You
Of
have
course,
to.
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I didn't like that you said they're more likely, but then because I respect your judgment, and that doesn't sit right with me. But please do. I think please go ahead and lay that out for us. What is Chris? No,
The alternatives, yeah, of course. Yeah.
Militarily, we don't really know how far Putin might want to go. And as I said, war has some self-dynamics, and appetite comes with the eating for Putin. But more and more the eating is, maybe he loses some appetite. That would be a positive sign, element. What could happen if Putin continues, wants to occupy all of Ukraine, change government in Kiev, and then he has a huge country to administer. And there will be a huge of resistance in Ukraine. So it's a little bit different to Czechoslovakia 68, when there was resistance, but not permanent. There was no guerrilla warfare or something. That would resemble the situation in Afghanistan 79. So in Afghanistan, the Soviet Union toppled the Kemal regime and occupied the country and lost the war. There has been atrocities and losses, and it was a burden for the Soviet Union's economy. So it was 10 years of war, where actually I have to say neutrality of Afghanistan would have been a better solution in 79 already for all participating parties, for the Soviet Union, for the US, for Afghanistan. But actually, President Carter at the time suggested a neutral Afghanistan at that time. It didn't work out, of course, as we know. So that would be the option for Russia in Ukraine, not a good option. So what if the Ukraine is continue fighting and has some resistance, it will not win the war militarily. Ukraine will not win the war. Some observers in the West are still hoping that putting weapons in and they would really defeat the Russian troops, and the Russian troops would withdraw without any concessions by Ukraine. I don't see this option. One option would be, which might still be possible, there would be a division of Ukraine, maybe along the Dnieper river. And then we have the situation like in Korea in 50 to 53, 3 years war. And it was about also about zones of influence. And then there was a permanent division after this war. That's maybe Russia would be able to control eastern Ukraine, but not the whole Ukraine. But Ukraine would have lost its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and there still would be the high tensions like we have in Korea as well. So the Austrian solution would be better for all of them, neutrality and withdrawal of all troops.
Why do you think that Putin right now started the war? I mean, you said before that it's obvious for Russia and for the Ukraine that the NATO members, or for the NATO and for Russia, that the NATO membership of Ukraine is not really realistic. Still, now he started the war under other preconditions, but I think we all agree that these preconditions he gave to his people are not really realistic. So I think it started now.
It's a very good question. There was not a necessity, and it's a war of choice. We have to say it's a war of choice. Not so. He might think, and it's not excluded, I would say, studying international security and history, that in a time of 10, 15 years, NATO might be perceived by Russia as an immediate danger if the world changes, because we do have a polarization now in the world, not only China, but USA and Russia. We do have an increasing polarization. So we can talk about this a little bit later. So that's, but it was not a necessity now, and it's not a war of necessity. So maybe it has to do something with Putin's ego, even so I hesitate a little bit to talk about personalities. China was in the mind of the US. So China was the main actor on the world stage. Russia was not that important. And it was seen more, as Obama said, at a regional power with nuclear weapons. So Russia wanted to put himself back on the world scene. And that I would not exclude that the first thought Putin had when he suggested this requests demanded, would say, not suggested, demanded his requests in December, that there could be a huge European security conference where Russia is one of the main actors, and then they would decide that there would be zones of influence, but NATO would not include Ukraine. So other issues, because he talked at that time, he used the phrase of the Helsinki Summit 75, security is indivisible. So security, so that might have been in mind that it's not going to happen, and he was not patient enough, and he wanted to have some legacy in history, and he wanted to put him back on the world stage, not with diplomacy, but with war. I guess it was a history of broken promises, what pushed Putin to act like this, going back to the 90s already, because he mentioned in his demands 1979 as a turning point. So why this cooked up to his decision not to go to war, it's hard for you to say.
May there be an aspect of internal dissent that is probably quite larger than we know? There have been all those moves against international organizations. There have been, of course, all these crackdowns on any opposition increasingly over the last few years. May it be that he is not quite as secure in his pony's saddle, and is that not also a hope for us? The internal Russian politics and the fact that he and his entourage completely failed to deliver on improving the economic lives of certainly the people outside the urban spaces. Don't you think that could have played a reason? I could have played a...
Yeah, I'm not such an expert on Russian internal politics, but of course his saddle is now weaker than it was before, so I did not really predict this. But I would not so say that the possibility, I don't see this of a coup, an internal coup. I don't see. I see more repression now coming. So, and sanctions always bring more repression. So that's not what the West thinks sanctions would cause, more respecting human rights and civilian rights. And so it's the opposite is true. So I know the statistics. If states are sanctioned for a long time, the fall in the rankings of human rights violations and democracy index and the corruption index increases. So sanctions will not enter war and will not bring an internal change and not a change of behavior. So I don't think sanctions will, they're morally justified. I would say I'm not totally against sanctions. They're morally justified. We have to do something, but not effective politically. So it's neither in external behavior nor internally would bring the results. But interestingly enough, wars, what I looked at as well, usually if states tend to go to war, you see an increase of military spending the years before. You didn't see it in this case. So the military spending in Russia was really low. So it is compared to NATO countries, it's 7% military, 7% of the NATO expenditures. So he was not prepared to go to war with NATO or something. So maybe he would say it was easy to go to war with Ukraine because the soldiers are very cheap. They don't get much of a salary. They are there anyway. You have to pay them. So there was no preparation for a huge war like we saw it before the First World War, Second World War, and also the Korean War, but it happened immediately during the war. So I don't know now the data, it might change during the war. The war endures that we have more, of course, more military expenditures. But there was no sign that so probably it was a miscalculation also by the Russians that it was an easy go to topple the government in Kiev. So nevertheless, we have to almost stalemate now militarily, but there is no question that Russian troops will prevail after a while, and concessions will have to be made, as I said.
You mentioned it, Chris. If it's okay, let's move on a little bit to the meta stage. You were talking about the polarization. U.S. already starting under Obama and continuing under the president that came after him, and withdrew or tried to withdraw more and more from their responsibilities in Europe, in my opinion, or would have wished and still I think wish for a more independent Europe. That's my question for the very end. And then we have China. So is globalization, I don't want to call it an experiment, but is it at an end? Because I actually thought it was rather successful, and I'm not only talking about corporations and capital being moved around, but the relatively open world. Is that coming to an end? And if it is, why is that? Because I truly believe that in the last 20 years, generally speaking, also statistically proven, I think, the majority of the world population has actually benefited, at least economically.
Yeah, early signs of the end of globalization were already the 9/11. So it was really flourished under President Clinton, and globalization but under Clinton also means primus inter pares for the US, and that's why he already expanded NATO as well. But nevertheless, we extrapolated the situation, the globalization of the 19th. But somehow the war on terror, we either with us, with them or with us. So that's what President Bush already introduced. But at 9/11 changed the American attitude as well, because the idea was already at that time then under Obama moving more towards China pivot to the east, and then the Middle East came back. The Middle East came back with the Palestinian issue, with the Iran issue. So the US is back in the Middle East, and the US always expected, as you say, that Europe would act more independently. So now the priorities are shifting again. President Trump and President Biden all wanted to concentrate on China. New feature of polarization is alliance building, and we saw all this alliance building in the East now, this new AUKUS, Australia, UK, US, the Quad, including also Japan and India, US and UK. Then this idea of alliance of democracies of President Biden, which is a little bit hypocritical as well, because the US does not hesitate also to cooperate with non-democracies, like Saudi Arabia, like Vietnam, if he needs a geopolitical partner. But also Russia is trying to secure its own sphere of influence with Belarus, and they have these contested areas. And Ukraine is one of them, where the spheres of influence are not really clear. And the Taiwan Strait is another contested area, and South China Sea, Middle East. And here we can expect some more hot conflicts like in Ukraine. But the good thing is that so far the Americans say that would not interfere in this war in Ukraine. That we had this contested area during the areas in the Cold War as well. Korea I mentioned, there was Vietnam, there was Afghanistan, and we had this crisis, Berlin and Cuba. But in none of these cases, the superpower confronted each other with military force. So not in Korea, not in Vietnam, not in Afghanistan. The other side supported militias, would send in weapons, but not interfere directly because they were afraid to have a world war, new world war with, or maybe with nuclear weapons. That's why it's wise for NATO and US to stay out of this conflict. Of course, we have increasing blurring gray areas that we have seen right now in Lemberg. But what we have globally is, if we speak about this meta image here, we are in a situation of globalization, alliance building, and also creating new ideologies, autocracies versus democracies. Russia does not have really an attractive ideology. That's why Russia was speaking about the fight against Nazis, which is nonsense in Ukraine, but trying to create something for the domestic people, and also this supporting Russia's abroad, the genocide thing, all absurd allegations, but to create some sort of ideological underpinning. So we have these features, and that will be with us for a while. Even so, the Ukrainian war will be over. We are moving towards a polarization in the world, a tripolar world, which might be worse than the Cold War. In the Cold War, over time, we had these recognized spheres of influence, except this contested area I was talking about. But over time, there have been arms control negotiations, arms control treaties. All of them have been cancelled now, except the START treaty, which is a leftover from the Obama administration. But the US canceled, under Trump, canceled all of them. Of course, they blamed each other, Russia and the US, that they would violate these treaties, but they could be easily with verification and adapting the treaties that would be they could have been easily saved. So they wanted to get rid of this situation. For example, in Europe, we don't have this INF treaty anymore. 2019, when Trump left the treaty, which prohibits the deployment of medium-range missiles on European soil, not only European, but mainly European, on European soil. And before this treaty went into force in 1987, there was the intention to deploy these medium-range missiles, the SS-20 in the Eastern Bloc and the cruise missiles and Pershing in Western Europe. And the result was a huge peace movement, because people would think, if the US and Soviet Union have a conflict, fight a nuclear war, they would fight a nuclear war on our territory. This peace movement contributed to the conclusion of this treaty. When now this treaty was abandoned in 2019, there was no peace movement. Nobody really paid much attention of it. We have a peace movement now because of the immediate war, which is good. But the situation that the whole thing might escalate to a nuclear war, and now there is no treaty to prohibit this medium-range missiles immediately. They're already almost deployed, I have to say. So they could be easily deployed and used. That was what I really was not really understanding, because the world was accepting it. Now with Putin's threat with nuclear weapons, maybe there is some wake-up call that nuclear weapons might still play a role, which is terrible. But if the war in the Ukraine escalates and NATO would be entangled in this war, and Putin would not be able to win a conventional war against NATO states, what he is not going to do. So I'm not excluding that he might start to use tactical smaller means maybe a little bit smaller than the Hiroshima bomb, using tactical nuclear weapons. So a confrontation between NATO and Russia could lead to really to a nuclear level. Of course, we had this the last time during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and there was a diplomatic solution and a face-saving solution afterwards, which both sides accepted. So that's Soviet Union would withdraw the missiles from Cuba, and Kennedy would promise to withdraw the tactical medium-range missiles from Turkey and Italy, which the US did not need very much anyway, because most of the missiles have been sea-based already. And also there was the promise that the US would not intervene in Cuba again, as it tried the year before in the Schweinebucht affair, swine, anyway. And so there was a last moment compromise. So I would hope that we are not coming that close to a nuclear exchange now in the Ukraine conflict. There has to be an immediate ceasefire and immediate negotiations and concessions. There is no good victory on the military side, of neither side.
I'd like to ask one more question from my side, and then you can have the last. You spoke about zones of influence, like obviously the superpowers have. In many discussions I had in the past days and weeks, people always told me this is ancient history. Today, countries should have their own say about whether they want to join NATO or they want to join the EU, or they don't want to. This should be like it should be today. What would you tell those people?
I think that's a very, very wrong argument. Of course, states should have the sovereignty to do what they want on their own territory. So that's so choose their membership in alliance like Ukraine, NATO. But you learn in the first semester of security studies about the security dilemma. So if one state makes a security decision, it affects other states. So just to explain it easily, if one state makes a sovereign decision to deploy missiles on its territory, of course it has consequences and raises fears among the neighbors and not only the mayors of other states. That was the case in Cuba. Of course the US was afraid if there was Soviet missiles on Cuban soil. Of course the US wanted to react. And the same is true for alliance. If some country wants to join an alliance, the other state would think, would I react? So the security dilemma is there. So we have to be very careful if we make a security decision. So that's an easy argument. It's a sovereign right of every state. Yes, it is, but it has consequences. You have to think about the consequences as well. So there have to be responsible decisions in the security field, and otherwise you have always, that's why I think this argument of the Helsinki summit was very wise, that security is indivisible. So you always have to think about the security concerns of all the other parties. If you read the final document of the Helsinki Final Act on the height of the Cold War 75, so there's no single mention of this expressions what we see in all these military doctrines, security doctrines right now. It's not mentioned enemy, not mentioned foe, rival, not even competitor. So these words are not used. It's a lot about cooperative security. Security is indivisible. Common security was even a common decalogue of values, which the Soviet Union even surprisingly accepted, because the Soviet Union at that time would say, "Okay, I accept this if you accept the existence of my sphere of influence." So that would lead, it contributed to the dissolution of communism, because communism, the value decalogue had an influence. It had to be published in the East European countries. It created the Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia. It was the basis for the Charter 77. I have some hope, however, a little bit, because after the Second World War, the atrocities of the Second World War led to the creation of the United Nations and the UN Charter 45. And it is the only instrument what we still can use today, even so great powers break international law all the time, not only Russia, the US as well. So not only mention Kosovo, Panama, whatever. So after the atrocities of this Crimean, not only now Ukrainian, I should say, Ukraine-Russian war, the international law might again be considered as a very important value. But of course, the United Nations and the UN Charter didn't prevent the Cold War and the polarization that we had then. And I'm afraid we are in a similar situation if we see even if we see a strengthening of international law after this war, but the polarization will continue. So that's not only Russia.
Now then, let me get in here, because it was quite ironic that you mentioned Putin's argument from the Helsinki conference that security is indivisible, which he used now to raid another country. But that's not my question. My question to you is, in the hope that you don't destroy my hopes for this afternoon again, as you've done several times, not on purpose, I know. Turkey and Greece are talking. The Visegrad states, which were one by one falling away from the European Union, one way or the other, at least in some parts, with the Polish legislative crisis. The Hungarians, well, that's another story, so they are still with Russia. But generally, I feel, sitting here in the Czech Republic, that people are realizing that unless Europe pulls its socks up rather quickly and integrates more deeply one way or the other, it will be done for. And that may be, for me at least, a little bit of hope for the future in the next 5 to 10 years as a European, that this is the case, that motivated by this war, the Europeans will find a way to get back together, especially being faced with what is pretty clear is going to happen. There's going to be some kind of new Iron Curtain. It has to be, because somewhere a new line will be drawn, if in Donbass or Dnieper or wherever. How do you feel about that? Do we have a chance to integrate more deeply, or are the forces that wish that to be otherwise stronger?
First of all, some clarification. The fact that Putin used security is indivisible and used it and abused it for going to war doesn't mean that the phrase is wrong.
No, that was attempted.
It was, of course, there has to be an environment also. We don't have this environment. We had at that time we had the German Ostpolitik, the detente between US and the Soviet Union as well. There was this summit between China and the US, which at some point was a wake-up call for the Soviet Union, such as that it had to make some concessions So there has to be an environment, and we don't have this environment, but that doesn't mean that security is still indivisible for all of them, even if you have a dictatorship on the other side. So that's I do think Europe has to get its act together. Unfortunately, now the debate is only on more military expenditures, and more military expenditures wouldn't have prevented the invasion in Ukraine either, because NATO is there and didn't prevent, deterrence of NATO didn't prevent Putin's decision to go to war either. And it would not be necessary, as I said, Russian military expenditures are minuscule compared to NATO's anywhere. And if the European Union talks about more military, I'm not against some military, better coordination of the European military, but expenditures as such is not really the answer. Because 2000, we had military expenditures as the European Union country to 250 billion dollars. It fell 10 years later to 150, and now we are back to 250, and it will increase. And if you take the current level of Russian military expenditures and the 2% expenditure increase of 2% GMP of Germany, Germany's military expenditures would be already 1/3 bigger than the Russians' military expenditures. So increasing military expenditure doesn't bring a solution. So there has to be a diplomatic initiative. So the European Union has to become diplomatically more active and successful. They failed in the Ukraine crisis, I have to say. To some extent, they were successful, and now it's falling apart again because of Russia. In the Iran talks, the JCPOA was a very successful European Union project as well. Took 13 years or 10 years, and now Russia links the Ukraine conflict to these negotiations. They were almost ready. It was the European Union called it a masterpiece of effective multilateralism, what it was. Here, you can see what the European Union could do. Not everybody had to be part of it. We had these 3 European Union countries. Now Great Britain is out of, still member of the Joint Commission of the JCPOA. And they took the initiative. It was not necessary that all the member states all the time agreed what was happening there. I think that's a little bit an excuse to say the European Union has to always to speak with one voice. It's not necessary. If some countries take the initiatives, the European Union also would chair it or participate, that the others would not be against it. It would be possible as well. So I do see also, in the Middle East, it's a game of the US, and US, Israel, Palestine, European Union is even so the European Union has wonderful suggestions about the two-state solution. It's not really involved diplomatically.
Well, sadly, I have to say you did not raise my hopes, but that's hardly your fault.
No, I hope that I think the European Union has the capacity to do it. It didn't really use it properly. So.
Well, let me say that as you have been the chair of the Marshall Plan, a fellow at John Hopkins, Austrian chair of Marshall
I was the
Plan.
chair, the Austrian chair in Stanford.
In Stanford. John Hopkins
I was also fellow at the John Hopkins.
Yeah, I mixed it up. Sorry, that the chair at the foundation of the Marshall Plan. Let us maybe next time hopefully talk about a Marshall Plan of sorts that it will take to resurrect Ukraine, or at least part of it. I hope for that rather sooner than later, as I'm sure do we all. Thank you very much for your time. Yeah, but I think that's something we will have and should talk about on time, is how to rebuild.
Hopefully soon, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for your time. Goodbye.
Yeah. Thank you for your time, and we will be back as always.
Hezky den, nashledanou.